Welcome to the Healthy Garden, Healthy Home program on controlling ants in your home and garden the healthy way. I want to start by telling you that Healthy Garden, Healthy Home is a cooperative effort between the University of California and the County of San Diego to bring information to our communities about how we can reduce the use of pesticides, but at the same time control the common pests of our gardens, homes, and landscapes. So the reduction of pesticide use is important to our communities because the majority of pesticide contamination in our waterways comes from residential properties. So the Healthy Garden, Healthy Home program is designed to give us an alternative to the use of pesticides and still control the pests of our gardens, homes, and landscapes. Are ants taking over your home? Have you used pesticide sprays, but the ants are still coming back? We have a solution. That solution is integrated pest management, a pest management strategy that is scientifically based on the biology and behavior of the organisms. So the measures that you take to control the insects are more effective for the long term versus the short term satisfaction of using pesticide sprays. So we can reduce or even eliminate the need for pesticides, which will save you time and money. And this method works because we employ several alternative strategies to the use of pesticides instead of relying on just one method. This doesn't mean that the use of pesticides is not allowed in an integrated pest management program. But if you decide to use pesticides, if it becomes necessary, you want to use them correctly and in a safe manner. So, to use IPM effectively, there are a few things we need to understand first. We need to know the insect or the organism that we're dealing with. So we need to know our enemy. So we'll look at the biology and identification of ants. Then we'll look at our expectations for controlling the ants. One thing we want to make sure we do is understand that we need to control the organisms and not try to completely eliminate them. So we will look at the long-term versus the short-term goal, and then we'll look at several strategies for management. And you can see here that chemical strategies are listed last because they're used as a last resort if all other methods are not effective. There are over 200 species of ants in California, but less than a dozen of those species are actually important pests. And we list Argentine ants here as number 1 because they are the most common ant species found in homes and gardens. You see several other species listed here. The last 3, the velvety tree ant, the southern fire ant, and the red imported fire ant, are all species that bite or sting. So they can be problematic as well. In order to effectively use IPM, you need to know which ant species is invading your home or garden, because effective management approaches will vary with the species. So there are several resources you can turn to help you identify the ant species. There are University of California Integrated Pest Management Pest Notes. You can find those online, along with the key to identifying common household ants. And then we also have the Master Gardener Hotline. So you can call them and describe to them what your problems are, and they can help you to identify potentially and control and apply the proper control strategies. So you want to be observant about how the ants are behaving, where they're living. You may even use a magnifying lens to determine what species the ants are. One other thing that's very important is we need to differentiate between ants and termites, because you don't want to apply ant control strategies if you have termites and vice versa. So there are differentiating traits that we can use to identify the ants versus the termites. One of the things we look at is the antenna of both the ant and the termite. You can see here that the ant antenna are bent or elbowed, and the termite antennae are not. The ant, like all insects in the order Hymenoptera, like bees and wasps as well, have a constricted waist, but the termites do not. They have the broad waist. If the wings are present, and you will find that ants will leave their nest in warm weather, some of them develop wings and fly off to start another colony, just like termites will eventually develop their wings and fly. So if the wings are present, you can determine the difference by noticing that the hind wing, or the rear wing on the ant, is smaller than the forewing, but on the termites the wings are the same size. You can also look at the material left behind by the insect. This material here is a sawdust material that's characteristic of carpenter ants. They don't actually feed on the wood like termites do. They just hollow out the wood and then they leave the sawdust behind. The termites, on the other hand, actually feed on the wood. So their pellets that they leave behind are very characteristic. So you can also look at those with a magnifying lens and be able to tell what you have. So it's important then to understand how ants live in general. All species of ants are social insects. They live in colonies, and the duties of the colony are divided among different types or castes of adults. So the ants go through complete metamorphosis. So they have 4 stages: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. Only the queens reproduce, and they are the largest in size. And you can see the queen here, along with some larvae and some pupa, along with the female worker ants. The female worker ants are sterile. They do not reproduce. They gather food, and they feed and care for the larvae and the males. They build tunnels and defend the colony. So these females make up the bulk of the colony, and they're the ones that you see tending to other insects in your plants, or making the trails that you see frequently coming into your house. Keep in mind, this is only a small percentage of the colony that you see here. And this is important to understand when it comes to control strategies, that you're only seeing a small percentage. So males do not participate in colony activities. Their sole purpose is to mate with the queens and the winged females that will become queens later on. As I mentioned earlier, some of the males and females will leave the colony, and eventually they will start a new colony of their own. So those females will become the new queens in the new colony. Ants do have food preferences, but they can change throughout the year. Argentine ants in particular like sweets all year. They like the honeydew secreted by other insects like scales, whitefly, and mealybug that suck plant sap. They will eat fruit, sugar, syrups, and honey. And then proteins in the spring, like seeds and nuts, dog food, fatty substances, and then I'm sure you've seen them eating dead or live insects and decomposing animals. So food is the deciding factor where ants, for where they choose to live. Workers will travel several hundred feet in search of food. And then nesting preferences also differ by species, but ants are usually nesting in soil. They'll nest next to buildings and along sidewalks, in close proximity to food sources and water. Excuse me. For example, trees and plants with the honeydew producing insects that I mentioned. They will nest near irrigation systems where the soil is moist. You can also find them under boards and stones, tree stumps, plants, under buildings, and other areas that are protected. Ants will enter buildings or move indoors for specific reasons. They're looking for food and shelter, warmth, water, refuge from dry, hot weather, when they're seeking food, they'll come in during the summer and fall when the honeydew producing insects are not as active. So this is when the ants become indoor pests. So you can see this particular species of pharaoh ant will nest indoors on walls, although we find them typically outside in California because of our warmer weather. Here's an example of the carpenter ants nesting in wood and eating sugar. Ants can become pests outdoors when they invade our gardens and lawns in very high numbers. So you can see here, you can see here they're nesting these pavement ants near the irrigation, so the soil is moist. And you see ants here that are farming, so to speak, the honeydew producing aphids. One of the other things that ants will do is protect the pest insect, like the aphids, from their natural enemies. So for example, if a lady beetle comes to feed on the aphids, the ants will actually fight off the lady beetle. So they can cause an increase in plant damage by insects like aphids because they tend to protect them. Ants like those honeydew producing insects because they feed on the honeydew. So that's a sugary source of food for them. And they can always be found in association with sucking insects. Ants are pests when they protect plant pests from their natural enemies or when they harm you. I mentioned earlier some of the biting and stinging ants, and a very important newer species to California is the red imported fire ant. So you want to be on the lookout for those. If you think you have red imported fire ant, you don't want to try to treat them yourself. They are aggressive. They will bite and sting, and you can see the damage here that they can do. They also like moisture with good drainage. They're typically found in green belts and lawns, bases of tree trunks, curbs, bedding plant areas, and so on. They may also be found in areas that have been recently landscaped. The soil is easy to make tunnels in, it's nice and moist, and so on. Fire ants will make a mound very much like a gopher mound, but the soil left on top is much finer than the soil you would find with a gopher mound. And if you disturb them by stomping on the ground near the mound, they will become aggressive and erupt from the mound. So that's one indication that you have the fire ant. The other thing you can look for, this is the southern fire ant, which is native to California. You can see the color difference here. This is more of a reddish brown, and the fire ant, the red imported fire ant, is actually darker in color. Believe it or not, after having said all this, ants can perform many useful functions in the environment. They do feed on other pests. They feed on dead insects and decomposing tissue from dead animals. And they can help to aerate the soil through their tunneling and nesting habits, which can be beneficial to the roots of plants. So now that we know something about ants, about our enemy, we can then turn to setting those realistic goals, long-term versus short-term, and we'll look at the strategies for managing the ants. First of all, we have to realize that it's unrealistic to attempt to eliminate ants or any other outdoor pest from an outdoor area. They're going to come in from your neighbor's yard, from the plants you buy at the store, many different ways that they can get into your environment. So instead of focusing on short-term management, we'll focus on reducing the population numbers and excluding the ants from buildings and those valuable plants, and then eliminating their food and water sources. So the long-term goal is, stop there for a second. So as I mentioned earlier, the worker ants you see trailing are only a small fraction of the colony. So spraying these trails with pesticides will only kill the ones that you see. So that's not a long-term strategy. Granular pesticides will only kill a very small fraction of the ants in the trail. And then perimeter sprays around your structures and other garden areas only kill those foraging workers, even if you repeat that spray on a regular basis. So while you're spraying, the ant queen is actually laying eggs. They become new workers, and then new colonies are being established with even more new workers. So to start your management program, you can ask yourself, are there changes that I can make in the garden, landscape, or in the house that will provide the effective long-term control? And we've provided some examples here. For instance, you can prune plants away from the structure so that ants can't use that as to gain access to the structure. You want to remove wood or any mulch or anything that might be right next to the house. You want to keep those materials 6 inches or so away from the foundation. You want to clean as much as possible inside and outside. And you want to make sure that you are controlling any water leaks that you may have, air conditioning water or leaking spigots, so that the ants don't find a nice moist area to nest in. We'll look at our alternative strategies then. So mechanical and cultural practices. These are things that we can do physically or things that we can do to care for the environment that will reduce the incidence of ants. So avoid planting those trees and shrubs that commonly attract the honeydew producing insects. Or if you do have these insects, you want to control them. You can ban the trunk of a tree or shrubs that produce fruit or floral nectar that the ants will sometimes feed on, using a sticky substance on the trunk of the tree. There's a substance called tanglefoot, but you want to make sure that you protect the tree trunk with some sort of material, and then you put the tanglefoot on top of that material. You need to keep that material stirred up, or the ants will eventually create a trail of their dead buddies, and they'll end up crawling over that trail of dead ants. So you keep that material stirred up to keep it effective. You want, as I mentioned earlier, trim branches to keep them from touching structures or other plants, and keep them off the ground. You want to keep plants, grass, and mulch, as I mentioned, several inches away from the building foundations. They make great nesting sites, and they can also disguise entryways that the ants may use to get into the structure. Excluding ants from buildings goes a long way to controlling them. They will use structural elements like wires and pipes to enter the structure and travel along those highways, so to speak, to their destination. So you can eliminate cracks and crevices both indoors and out with caulking, or petroleum jelly will also work. Okay. Sanitation is key, especially indoors, to managing ant pests. So you want to seal and store your attractive food items, those sweet things like the sugar, honey, and so on, pet food, enclose all those things in containers that are also clean on the outside. You want to keep everything clean. Rinse out your recyclable containers, remove them from the building, clean up grease, and remove garbage on a regular basis. Look for the indoor nesting sites. Sometimes you'll find them in potted plants. You want to remove those plants from the area, and you can actually treat those plants outdoors by submerging them in a material that will take care of the ants. And then you can move the plant back into the house, or you can remove the soil from the plant and put it in fresh soil. I mentioned that chemical strategies are not eliminated as part of an IPM program, but again, they're used as a last resort. So if all other methods are failing, the best tool we have for ant control are baits. They're either a sweet or a protein attractant that's mixed with a pesticide. They work better than sprays or granular pesticides because the worker ants recruit other workers to that site, and the ants feed each other by transferring food mouth to mouth. So the workers will take the bait back to the colony, to the nest, and it will help to destroy the entire nest rather than just a few of those workers that you see in the trail. Using baits effectively is very important. You only want to use them when there's a problem. You don't want to attract ants into an area where they haven't been previously. So you want to place them outdoors to attract ants out of the building rather than placing them indoors and attracting the ants into the building. You want to place the baits where they're easily found by the ants, so near their nests, on their ant trails, and beneath plants that they're frequenting. Even though baits are safer than many other pesticides that are used for ants or that are sold for ant control, you want to place the baits where children and pets don't have access to them. Do not use pesticide sprays when you're using bait stations, because it will interrupt the ants taking the bait to the colony. So you want to allow them to take that bait as long as necessary until you no longer see the ants. This can take a few days, but if you're patient, it's well worth the wait. You can offer different active ingredients in the bait stations depending on the time of year. See which one they're most attracted to and use that one. If you have an ant emergency, determine what the attractant is and remove it. That's the first thing to do. The next thing is locate the entry points. Find out where those ants are coming in. So follow the trail back to their entry point and then plug that entry point with caulk or petroleum jelly. And you want to vacuum, wipe with soapy water, or even use a window cleaner, because many of the ants will leave an odorous trail that the other ants then follow to that food source. So you want to remove that trail. So you use soap and water or window cleaner or something like that. And then put out your bait stations. Apply the gel bait. You can buy that. And then continue to clean the trails while the workers take the bait. So again, you have to be persistent and patient, but it's well worth the wait. So we've looked at our long-term strategies. I hope you understand the benefits of the long-term goal versus the short-term satisfaction. And so I want you to keep that long-term goal in mind. The bait formulation should be slow acting to ensure that the worker ants reach the colony and feed the other members. If the ants die soon after eating and they haven't made their way back to the nest, then it won't be an effective control. So you may need to replace those baits frequently. They will, if enough ants are in the nest, they will deplete that bait. You need to replace that so they continue to have that source to take back to the nest. Keep up with your sanitation strategies. So don't provide them with something new that's attractive in addition to the bait. Baits are safer because there's less exposure for non-target organisms. I'll talk about what those are. And there's little chance of the pesticide entering the watershed. The short-term satisfaction of using those regular sprays really costs everyone. Because the pesticides are not effective over the long term, they must be reapplied frequently, and that can be very time-consuming and expensive. In addition to that, if the pesticides are applied incorrectly, they can have toxic effects on those non-target organisms. So your children or grandchildren, pets, beneficial insects that will help you to control some of those other pest organisms, and then even your plants can be negatively affected if contacted with the incorrect material. So when pesticides are applied to our homes and gardens, they may drift in the air or be washed into a storm drain by irrigation or rain, where they end up in our watershed. This contamination can have an impact even a long distance from the point of application, because the pesticides are not treated in the storm drain system. So they end up in the creeks and streams, lagoons and bays, where they can negatively impact those habitats as well. This is important to all of us because our watersheds provides our municipal and domestic water supply, recreation, and wildlife and estuarine habitats. There are two pesticides in particular, chlorpyrifos and diazinon, that are very toxic to aquatic invertebrates. So if those invertebrates are killed by the pesticides, then the fish who feed on them no longer have a food source, and then they will move on or starve out. And the birds then that rely on the fish as a food source will also have to move elsewhere or deal with a depleted food source. So we can reduce the use of chemicals that pollute our water resources by using integrated pest management. One thing that's very important if you determine that you need to use a pesticide is to read the label. The label will give you information about the active ingredient. It will tell you about proper storage and disposal for that pesticide. You want to read that label and follow the directions to the letter. It's against the law to use more pesticide than is recommended on the label, and it is never more effective. So you're putting product in the environment that does not need to be there. I want to point out here that chlorpyrifos and diazinon are the primary pesticides threatening surface water quality. Chlorpyrifos is sold under the trade names of Dursban and Lorsban, and diazinon has been taken off the market. You're no longer able to purchase it. If you have it, you can still use it, but it's not recommended. So we've gone through our program, and this should help you to control low to moderate numbers of ants in your garden, home, and landscape. If you find that you have high numbers invading your home, you may need to hire a professional pest control service. A structural pest control operator with the appropriate license is required, and you want to be sure that the company you choose uses an IPM or integrated pest management program. Finally, I'll remind you it's the water that connects us. So again, read those pesticide labels and follow the directions. Store them in a safe manner and dispose of unused pesticides properly so that they don't end up in our waterways. And finally, we'll provide you with some useful phone numbers for disposing of those unused pesticides: the Master Gardener Hotline, the UC Cooperative Extension Office, where you can get lots of information about various pests, including ants, and then finally the Agricultural Commissioner's Office. So I'd like to thank you for attending today. I appreciate your attention, and if you have any questions, I'll take those.